Okay, I could just start us off. I'm not going to talk about the nitty-gritty of production because production style, technique, method, equipment is going to vary from farm to farm, but I am going to show some photos of commercial production, talk a little bit about how we got here and some of the work that I'm doing and some collaborators are doing that are really helping the industry move forward. Maybe. Okay. So, so everybody just raise your hand quick. You know what hemp is? Yeah. Okay. I like to, one of the biggest questions I get at events, I do SpringFest, if you're familiar with that event, a huge campus-wide program in April that attracts thousands of people. And I get a lot of kids that go, what is this plant? So it's an annual crop grown for the stalk, seeds, and metabolites. So we have lots of different applications of these different components of the plant. We're going to talk a lot about grain and fiber, though there will be a talk about a CBD-derived material that's really interesting that hopefully is new to a lot of you. But we're primarily growing it as a row crop, but we can also grow it as a horticultural crop for the cannabinoids, and we do have some indoor growers in the state. We know that cannabis prohibition has hindered the hemp industry. I'll briefly go over, some of the regulations, but Justin covered that pretty well, so I won't spend a ton of time on it. And one of the things that I've thought about a lot, I know a lot of people in the industry feel this sentiment of, we can't really compete with other commodities. They've had a lot of years of research and production and stakeholder investment. But I often think, if this plant wasn't cannabis sativa, would it be a major crop in our agricultural landscape? So just as we go through these talks and think about innovation and product development, I often come back to this question, and hopefully by the end of the seminar, you will also often think of this question when we talk about, challenges in the industry. So I think all of us are fairly familiar with this, but we're talking about hemp type cannabis. So by the legal definition of no more than 0.3% delta-9 THC on a dry weight basis. We'll talk about the fiber, the oil, food applications, industrial applications, feed, which is really exciting, and then a little bit about cannabinoids. And then, of course, we have high THC cannabis, which is not legal in the state of Indiana, in the sort of traditional sense that we think about medicinal and adult use in other states. So how many of you are familiar with some of the U.S. hemp history? Yeah, a lot of people. Anybody not? Not to call you out, but okay. So as far as we know, hemp arrived to North America in 1545, so it's been here for a while. And it was a really important fiber crop. They used it for other applications. You can find old photos of hemp or cannabis tinctures used for medicinal applications, but it was a really important fiber crop throughout the United States. We know Kentucky was a major producer between the Civil War and World War I, which is why we saw Kentucky really push for hemp production because they knew, it had a history, there's economic importance, and there's lots of products that can be made from it. And we have the Marijuana Tax Act, which effectively stopped production of cannabis and of hemp. But what I will say is we did have production in Indiana. Has anybody seen ditchweed, feral hemp around the state, leftover populations? Really interesting genetic work going on in that at University of Wisconsin and Cornell. But the top photo is actually from a farm in northern Indiana. So we had commercial production in the state. So it's exciting to be able to bring it back. And then it was grown for the military in World War II. So this sort of hemp for the war. So hemp, I mentioned, would it be a major commodity if it wasn't lumped in with higher THC? And we see it effectively banned in 1970. Justin mentioned the 2014 Farm Bill. Hemp was grown on a Purdue research farm in 2015. So Purdue has been doing research. Before I got here in 2017, they were trying to understand cultivation in the state because they saw the opportunity in the crop. And then, of course, 2018. 2019 was our first real commercial production year, and we had this large dedication of acreage across the United States, which caused some issues. But at least we have some commercial production, and that was what led to the creation of my position. So I wouldn't be here likely in this capacity if it wasn't for the 2018 Farm Bill. So why research hemp? I get this question a lot. It's changed I don't get it as frequently as I used to, but it's a really interesting re-emerging crop in the United States with a long association with human history, thousands of years of cultivation across the world for lots of different applications. And in my lifetime, I may not get an opportunity to see a crop like this that has so many uses brought into commercial production. So it's a really exciting plant to work with. And I've been working on it now for 8 years. And so it's changed a lot. We have a diversity of applications, which makes it a really interesting plant to work with. It has the potential to diversify current crop rotations, which, as many of you know, I know I have farmers in the room, this is desperately needed in the Midwest. We need to have another option for growers to diversify their farm and hopefully reduce some risks in, volatile markets with changing environments. So some of the challenges in the industry, and I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail: variety selection, best management practices, and competition with other crops. So what is hemp going to displace in the field season? What acreage is going to get put into hemp rather than corn, soybeans, some other crop? So I'm working on variety selection and best management practices, and then supplying material to other researchers to hopefully develop some novel products. Local and regional processing is a really big challenge. This is a map from Hemp Industry Association that shows some of the different processing facilities around North America. Not all of them are, decortication. Some of them are taking the fiber and turning it into other products. So not that initial processing. But when we think about, we'll use ethanol as an example. We think about how many ethanol plants we have in Indiana alone. We just don't have the local processing that we need to really scale up production. So that's a big area that needs to expand. Product development, which you're going to hear a lot more about today. Consumer perception. So there's a lot of research going on at University of Kentucky in the economics department, looking at consumer perception, what motivates people to buy certain hemp products or not buy products. Is it cost? Is it thinking that, it's cannabis, it has THC in it? What are the reasons why people aren't buying products? And then support for the industry. I'm so happy to see people here supporting this event, but we could always improve and have more stakeholder, legislative, private industry support. But it has come a long way. So into the fun stuff, the stuff that I'm really proud of and excited to share. Has anybody heard of the Midwestern Hemp Database? Yeah. So this is a public tool run through University of Wisconsin that was started for grain and fiber in 2020. So we've had production trials. And what we've done in Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin is taken all of our production data and put it into a central repository that's publicly available where growers can look at different variety performance. So this really is trying to address the concern that growers might have of there's all these genetics available from all over the world and from the United States. Which one is going to work at my location? So we have this tool that's available that has multiple years of data that you can access. You can search specific varieties and you can look at performance information. You can look at THC compliance as well. We have some genetic material from China that maybe is not always compliant. So we have that data in the database in addition to yield and some of the agronomic questions we're addressing, like planting date and the amount of nitrogen to apply. So this is a great resource that I would encourage everybody, even if you're not growing, you're just interested in looking at the data, please check it out because this has been a pretty intensive process to get all this data uploaded. The other thing that I'm working on right now, in addition to variety trials that go into that repository, is addressing this question about how much nitrogen does the plant need. There are other fertility requirements, but we're focusing on nitrogen because this is something that in the literature is fairly unclear. You hear quite a range of rates that can be applied, and I'm going to show some slides just on fiber. Grain's a different story, but one of the things we hear is the plant doesn't need anything. You can just put seed in the ground and it will grow, and that's true. It is a pretty resilient plant, and you can put it in some pretty harsh environments and it will grow, but we want to make it profitable for the growers, and we want to figure out what's that point where we don't really need to apply additional nitrogen, or are they losing money, or what's the environmental cost to applying too much nitrogen. So what I have here is Indiana, Michigan, and Illinois data from 2023, and I'll show 2024 data. But what I think is really interesting about the Indiana data is we're really maximizing our yield at 100 pounds or 100 units of nitrogen applied. And this isn't like a coated urea. This is just a broadcasted urea after planting. But we're seeing, above that, we're not getting a higher yield. So that's really promising for growers to not dump a bunch of fertilizer on, because the thought is it's a vigorously growing plant. You need a lot of nitrogen to get all that biomass. And we're seeing, well, that is actually probably not true in our location. And then you look at Michigan, they're actually maximizing their yield at 50 units of nitrogen applied. Different soil type, different organic matter, different climate. But this is really promising to see that, yes, the literature that we see out of other countries is actually being supported by the data that we're collecting, that we're not needing to apply huge amounts of nitrogen to increase yield. Now in 2024, we have data from Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And I'm going to point out that Michigan, we're seeing a similar trend, though their yields were much lower than 2023, where they're not getting an added yield benefit by increasing the amount of nitrogen they're applying. In Indiana, we're seeing that, yes, we're increasing yield as we apply more, but we're not seeing a huge difference between the 100 and 150 pounds. And then Wisconsin is what I think is most interesting. They're actually seeing a decrease in yield with an increased application of nitrogen, which is really important for growers to know, because if they're used to a corn system where they're applying a lot more nitrogen, they may actually see a decrease in yield in certain scenarios, like I saw in Wisconsin. So I think this hopefully is going to provide a lot of data. We're completing our final year of this project this summer. So hopefully we can have a really clear image at the end to say, we have these general recommendations. So there is commercial grain hemp harvest. We have a grain grower here that's produced hemp before, but this photo is not from this grower's farm. This is from another farm in northern Indiana. And so one of the questions is, how do I fit it into my system? And so we have combines that growers are using to harvest the crop and put it in their grain bins and manage it successfully. So I think this is really promising when we think about how to fit it into our current rotation system. What's a little bit more unique is the fiber system. So we can use other types of mowers, but there is specialized harvesting equipment now available. This is a piece of equipment from Europe that is a multi-height cutter that was brought down from Illinois into Indiana for a fiber harvest last year. And so this cuts the stems into shorter sections, which makes it easier to then rake it and bale it. So this is a huge advancement, that this tool is now available and is not a totally unrealistic price tag to purchase this or share it in a cooperative sense. The individual who purchased it rents it out to farmers across the Great Lakes region. And so now, we didn't have this option when I started doing research in hemp, and now there is commercial equipment available in North America to harvest the fiber in a more efficient way. And then I want to talk about, lastly, hemp in rotation. So we have this sort of traditional 2-crop rotation in Indiana, corn and soybeans. Maybe we throw in some wheat in there. But the question is how do we fit hemp, or where do we fit hemp into the rotation? I'm not specifically doing rotation work, but I've planted hemp following different crops, and I've had growers plant hemp following different crops. So we've seen it successfully go after corn, and after soybeans, and after winter wheat. So I think there's an opportunity, because we have a lot of different genetic material and we grow the hemp for different purposes, to fit it into different rotation schedules successfully, which makes this crop very versatile. So if there's maybe a crop failure and growers need to put something else into the ground, there's the possibility of planting later maturing hemp into the field. I think this maybe reduces a lot of the risks that growers have with the crop when we look just at production. So we know that farmers need to diversify the agricultural landscape in the Midwest. This is really important. There are lots of initiatives looking at that, looking at resilient agriculture, looking at what other options might be available in the Midwest. And hemp's often cited as being more environmentally sustainable. Part of this has to do with inputs. Part of it has to do with the fact that we have very few pesticide options available. We have one conventional herbicide. I think it'll be 2 conventional herbicides this summer. So we just don't have a lot of the options. And so growers are getting creative in the way that they manage the crop. But we're not going to get widespread adoption without the establishment of best management practices, giving recommendations on what varieties are going to work best. And then, of course, processing infrastructure. My recommendation to growers is if you don't have a place to sell the crop, why are you growing it? I know innovation is really important, and so doing research on your farm, small tracts of land is very powerful, but for large-scale commercial production, we need to have processing infrastructure. So I'm going to wrap up. I know I'm a little over time. I tend to do this. I just want to acknowledge that there are a lot of Purdue faculty, staff, and students that have assisted on projects over the years, too many to list on one slide. It's been really powerful to have collaborations within this department in agronomy, but also in food science, botany and plant pathology, in departments outside of the College of Agriculture. So I just don't want to understate how important these collaborations are. The Midwest Hemp Research Collaborative members, which help contribute data to the Midwest Hemp database, we're a pretty powerful group and have been able to reach thousands of stakeholders across our 4-state region and educate them at in-person and virtual events. Our on-farm research growers, very important. National collaborators, we have a national S1084 hemp group, and we have a central database that has information from all of the states that participate in this nationally supported program. And then federal and regional agencies. A lot of the hemp research has been supported by USDA, NEFA, state agencies and regional agencies. So these grants have been critical in doing research and providing educational materials to growers. We work with USDA facilities in Peoria and now in New Orleans. And so these facilities have been critical in advancing the industry. And then we have an endowment that we received to get a processing piece of equipment from an individual who was very generous. And so now we can actually process the hemp fiber out of the farm. So that is all I have. I can take probably a couple questions, and then I want to move on to our next speaker. Remember to use your mic. I know that was a lot. I cut down like 20 slides from what I had last night.
Well, hi, thanks. I want to say that was a great presentation, so I really appreciate it. My name is Emily Usher, and I'm with the Diverse Corn Belt Project. And we hear all the time at our meetings with farmers about the market piece and that whole thing about you don't want to grow it until you can sell it. So what would you, how could we encourage markets to establish themselves in the Midwest and be a resource for our Midwestern growers?
That's a great question. I might leave that for our next speaker, who I think is going to cover that a little bit in his talk. I mean, we have to have industry come in and want to support and want to have the processing facilities and the product development and see value in the crop. We try to address stakeholders, some who may be really interested in investing in the industry. And so we'll talk to some people about that in a little bit. But trying to get people, it's something I'm trying to figure out of how do you get people to want to come to Indiana, to Michigan. We do have a processor in St. Louis. And so that's capturing some of the growers in Illinois and Missouri and maybe in Kentucky. We have processors in Kentucky, some in Wisconsin. So, but not a lot, not like they do in the Western states. So it's a complicated question that I don't have the best answer to. I mean, there's many facets. Legislative and support from state government is important. You know, what are the financial incentives to bringing a business to Indiana versus taking it out to a Western state? So I need an economist really to come in and give a talk. In the chat.
Yeah, it says if it is not for cannabis, why do you need the license?
Well, so
That's the question.
yeah, so the question about why do you need a license if it's not for cannabis? And we do have some of our wonderful state chemist representatives here who could also weigh in, but it's still cannabis sativa, even though it's low THC. So it still needs a license because of the regulations. Will it always be the case? I don't know. I'm not a fortune teller. I can't see the future. But it is a good question. One that my answer is it's cannabis sativa, so it's going to be regulated.
I'll only add that you have to have a license so that we can make sure that it isn't cannabis.
Yes.
The whole point is that we're there to make sure it's below 0.3. That's pretty much it.
How much of the hemp product on the market is intoxicating hemp?
Okay, I have just a couple questions in the chat I'll go through really quick. Has there been any updates on phytoremediation standpoint? So there is ongoing research across the US looking at phytoremediation of heavy metals. Hemp can uptake heavy metals. There's a possibility to use it as a phytoremediator. The question is, what do you do with the crop then? Is it one that you incinerate? Can you extract any metals from it? Or can you put it in some kind of matrix where those metals are trapped? The other area that's being researched is hemp's uptake of PFAS or forever chemicals. So there's ongoing research looking at hemp's ability to take those up. Maybe not for remediation, because there's a lot in some of the contaminated ground, but more from a standpoint of we can't grow food crops on that land. Could we grow an industrial crop that could be used for something else? So the growers could still grow a crop, get profit, but it's not going to have a risk to a consumer. So that's all ongoing. There's some really interesting PFAS work going on across the country.
They started to interact with each other.
Okay.
I'm not good, so.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna I'll read through those people in the chat and I can address them during the next talk. But I want to hand it over to our next speaker, Jonah Williams, who's going to talk about hemp and carbon and markets, and hopefully answer some of the questions on the industry.